The Book of the Dead is one of those extremely iconic products of ancient Egyptian culture, right up there with mummified bodies and pyramids. However, unlike mummified bodies and pyramids, the iconic status and the centrality of the Book of the Dead is of a much more recent date. Pyramids and mummies were a source of fascination for Europeans as far back as classical antiquity, but the Book of the Dead, on the other hand, came into the canon, the Egyptological canon, that is, much more recently. Now, this means that the Book of the Dead was closely entangled with the creation of the ancient Egyptian afterlife, the interpretation of the ancient Egyptian afterlife in the 19th century. The two really came into being in tandem, we could say. The Book of the Dead was interpreted in the early 19th century onwards in a way that had a number of presuppositions baked into it that had been created over the centuries before people actually knew much about the Book of the Dead, its imagery, let alone the accompanying text. This raises a number of questions, especially since the Book of the Dead and the afterlife that it seems to describe is very much part and parcel of modern understandings of ancient Egyptian conceptions of life after death. So if those presuppositions were created largely without input from ancient Egyptian sources and have continued into modern-day conceptions, do we need to rethink some of our understanding of what the Book of the Dead is? Now, I'm going to argue today that we should rethink parts of what we think the Book of the Dead is, and the second part of my lecture today is going to be suggestions about what that might look like. The Book of the Dead was virtually unknown prior to Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. It's not that people hadn't collected books of the dead in various media, but the connection that would become popular in the 19th century onwards of the Book of the Dead and the ancient Egyptian afterlife was not generally made at that time. So that makes it a reasonable move to go back and ask what European scholars expected about the ancient Egyptian afterlife at around 1800, so just before the Book of the Dead was becoming known to wider European audiences. The expectations that had been formed at that time, around 1800, basically formed the framework for both the Book of the Dead and the more generally changing conceptions in the 18th into the 19th century about what the afterlife was, mainly the Christian afterlife, the actual afterlife, if you will. But those expectations ended up spilling in to the interpretation of the ancient Egyptian afterlife by mainly Christian scholars. So the combination of these ingredients shaped by the mold of early modern expectations arguably is what ends up in the modern day concept that I've summarized at the bottom here. So the Book of the Dead as a guidebook to the afterlife, which conveniently describes what happens when you die. It even illustrates it. Predicated on an ethical judgment leading to rewards and punishments depending on the quality of your life. And then a couple of further prerequisites for salvation that ended up playing a major role for the 19th century understanding of the ancient Egyptian afterlife, even if they don't play as much of a role in the understanding of the Book of the Dead. The idea of the necessity of the eternal preservation of the body and an eternal supply of food and drink. So these ideas probably sound quite familiar because they ended up being very successful for understanding and interpreting what the ancient Egyptians thought about life after death and have continued in this form more or less to the present day. But let's have a closer look, break down those expectations that formed the funnel in the previous slide. How did people arrive at this particular understanding of the ancient Egyptian afterlife at a time when Egyptian texts couldn't be read and Egyptian iconography was rather poorly understood? To see if I can get this to... yeah, here we are. So as you can probably tell from the fact that this covers about half a millennium on a single slide, there's some simplification going on here, but these are some of the key dates in terms of changes of ideas, the sort of accumulation of notions of what the ancient Egyptian afterlife was like. So we have in the early Middle Ages, in the early Middle Ages, we have this idea that mummification was meant to preserve the body eternally. That came out of an intersection of a number of different ideas. It had to do with developing methods of embalmment in Europe to bring dead bodies back from the Crusades and that sort of thing so that they could be buried, which was thus squarely focused on preserving the body. It also had to do with the use of substances from mummified bodies in European medicine with curative effects. And it had to do with the simple observation that once you unwrapped mummies, as people often did back in the day, they were seen to be preserved bodily features to an extent that belied their millennia old status. So combining these ideas, there was the notion that what the Egyptians must have wanted, not just a side effect of whatever they were doing, but what they wanted, the goal of the purpose of mummification was to preserve the bodies. And since it was natural for European scholars, travelers, pilgrims to make the connection between death and eternity, it was assumed that the Egyptians wanted to preserve the body eternally. So that idea, still with us of course, has a very long history and is based on a relatively deductive framework. Then in the 16th century, following the advent of the printing press, a number of classical authors writing about ancient Egypt and ancient Egyptian mortuary religion more specifically came to light and were studied and translated by scholars. In particular, there were two authors that attracted a main interest in this connection, namely the historian Herodotus, who has a strange passage in his book about ancient Egypt where he says that the Egyptians believed in the immortality of the soul and that they believed that when a human died, its soul would move into an animal that was being born at that time, and once that animal died, in turn, it would move into a new animal of a different species. And in this way, the soul moved through every species of animal over a period of 3,000 years before finally returning to a human body again. Now, this is an idea that, unlike the ideas about mummification that we just talked about, will sound very alien to people familiar with the modern Egyptological concept. But for a very long time, since the 16th century and until about the middle of the 19th century, this was a core idea in the understanding of ancient Egyptian mortuary religion and afterlife beliefs. We're going to look a little bit at how it was gradually faded out, but the idea of an immortality of the soul was important to Christian scholars, of course, as was the notion of reincarnation, as strange as it might seem, because it was quickly reinterpreted by combining it with authors like Plato or the so-called Hermetic writings, which also express ideas about reincarnation, but with the added notion that the identity of the animal body that the soul gets incarnated into is dependent on the soul's behavior during life. So Herodotus doesn't have anything like that. He has a very mechanistic system. You just need to go through every species of animal. But Plato says that bad, sinful souls get incarnated as donkeys or wolves or other undesirable animals, whereas if you are very virtuous, you can be incarnated as a human being, perhaps even a human being of the highest order, that is to say, a philosopher. So you get this notion of a graded scale and an underlying notion of judgment. Now, this was a very attractive idea to European scholars because they would assume, given how many resources the Egyptians evidently expended on mortuary practices, that something had to be at stake. And for something to be at stake after life, to a Christian scholar would immediately suggest some kind of judgment on ethical merits. So this idea was useful for establishing that. Then the second main author here is Diodorus from the 1st century BCE, who, like Herodotus, writes about the technicalities of mummification and that sort of thing, but he also writes about a particular ritual that's carried out prior to burial, where people are invited to come forward with any reproaches of the deceased, and there is a tribunal which decides on the basis of the accusations that might come forward, any arrears against the deceased, that sort of thing, whether the deceased is going to be allowed burial or not. So Diodorus very clearly says that this is a ritual. It's not a belief about the afterlife. He says that the Greeks misunderstood it as a belief about the afterlife, which is why, or how they got their ideas about the underworld and judgment in the underworld. But to Diodorus, this is very clearly a ritual allowing or deciding whether a deceased is allowed to be buried or not. And it gets quite intricate. There's also the notion that similarly, for that reason, you can put up the bodies of your dead ancestors as security for a loan, for instance, and you don't get to bury them until the loan has been repaid. So there's a whole social system, and to Diodorus that's key because it helps instill a sense of morality in the populace. If you know that if you're not behaving, if you are not in good standing with your fellow citizens, when you die, you won't get buried. So this is a way to motivate people towards good behavior. And that idea gets picked up in the 17th century, where it is pointed out that ethical side of Diodorus's funerary judgment actually makes it quite similar in its sort of social function to the Christian belief in an afterlife judgment, namely that either way, if you're going to be judged after death, whether by humans or by God, you are, all things being equal, going to behave better. So that parallelism is constructed, and then very quickly after, the conclusion is drawn that actually, probably despite what Diodorus says, what he was actually talking about was a transcendent judgment, a divine judgment in the beyond, and so the description of the ritual gets reinterpreted as something that happens in the afterlife rather than a ritual taking place on Earth. Again, we can see the motivation for this. Just like with the reinterpretation of Herodotus, it makes the Egyptians a little bit more similar to Christianity, and makes it a little bit easier to understand what they were up to. Why were they so bent on funerary practices? Well, because they held similar beliefs to those of Christians. So together, this is what leads to what I've labeled here the traditional understanding. So this is the early modern understanding of the ancient Egyptian afterlife, preservation of bodies for eternity, and then an afterlife judgment with rewards and punishment, possibly through reincarnation, which then becomes a way to either reward or punish the soul for the deeds during life. Then in the 18th century, a couple of spin-offs that have less to do with the classical authors themselves come into play. We have, from the 1730s forward, we get a particular way of interpreting ancient Egyptian funerary culture as an initiation. Now, this is dependent on or inspired by, in particular, a novel by Jean Terrasson, whom I've mentioned here, who writes about it's a novel, but it's presented as the translation of an ancient manuscript, and it's supplied with footnotes, a whole scholarly apparatus. Not, I think, to deceive people, but as a particular genre of novel writing at the time. In this novel, the main character, Prince Sethos, undergoes an initiation under the Great Pyramid, where he is shown that there is a secret society of priests who are living in underground chambers. He undergoes a series of trials. And so we get this connection between what looks like funerary culture in ancient Egypt is actually a matter of initiation, and there is a sort of more mundane, in a sense, truth underlying the myths that the ordinary populace is being told. And this basic framework we see show up at around the same time in Freemasonry and various other sorts of ritualistic interpretations of ancient Egyptian religion. So we get this introduction of a notion of trials and tribulations that's not found in the classical authors. Then a little bit later, we begin to see what historians Colleen McDaniel and Bernhard Lang has referred to as a move towards an anthropocentric afterlife, as opposed to an earlier theocentric afterlife. So where in earlier times, the focus in the afterlife has been on the becoming united with God. Increasingly, it's understood in terms of human life. So we have the notion of experiences and a sort of materiality of the afterlife, of activities, journeys. There's even the notion of an ongoing spiritual betterment, even in the afterlife. So increasingly, it comes to be understood on those individualistic, anthropocentric terms, which in the first instance is a changing conception of the afterlife in Christianity and various derivations, for instance, spiritualism during the 19th century, all kind of revolve around this this general development, but it also ends up spilling into the conceptions about the ancient Egyptian afterlife, because again, it was modeled all along quite tightly on Christian conceptions, and so it makes sense that it sort of gets updated in the early 19th century and ongoing through the 19th century. We get this increasingly anthropocentric idea also of the ancient Egyptian afterlife. So we add those two notions here in the 18th century. Now, before we move on to what then happened when the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead was studied against this background, let's just note that people did know and collect manuscripts of the Book of the Dead earlier. Here's an example from 1704, of course, well before the script could be read. And Rigord here understands the text as a theological treatise that he suggests was carried by a mummy. It's written on linen, carried by a mummy as a means of protection, in the same way, he says, as people some of his contemporaries carry the Gospel of John as a protective means. So it's not, there's nothing particularly funerary about it, even though it was used for the protection of a dead body. Similarly, another, also as it happens, a linen Book of the Dead was published as part of a large survey of antiquity in 1724, and here the vignettes here that we would now classify as belonging to chapter 149 of the Book of the Dead are understood, where they are sort of guardians of individual gates, are understood here as a calendar. The label here is a calendar. Again, no one could read the text, so it's conjecture, but the conjecture does not go in the direction of anything specifically funerary. However, there were other parts of the imagery that we would nowadays connect to the Book of the Dead that did receive a funerary interpretation. A very good example, for several reasons, of this is found in the antiquarian Alexander Gordon's interpretation of the decoration of a coffin lid brought back from Egypt to London and eventually ending up at the British Museum, where he is looking in the quoted passage here at the top part of the decoration, where we see a variation of the familiar scene of the weighing of the heart, the enthroned Osiris here, the owner of the coffin being led into his presence. Again, a variation of a very common motif, as it was increasingly becoming known only really in the 19th century. So Gordon writes here, "The two figures by the balance perhaps may symbolize the opposite good and bad principles. These seem each, by pulling the scales down towards their own side, to claim, as it were, the soul of the deceased for its own. The balance symbolizing that after the actions of the deceased are, as it were, weighed, the hierogrammatius, or sacred scribe, already mentioned, enumerates them before Pluto, the supreme judge of the shades, that he may pass sentence on the deceased, who seems, as it were, led in by the agatho demon before his tribunal already described." So again, remember, there's no text accompanying this, so this is a purely iconographic interpretation of the scene, and many of those details will seem very familiar, even though they were arrived at completely intuitively. Now, we might conjecture about Gordon's inspirations for this, but actually there's a detail here that shows us quite clearly what kind of ideas he had in mind, what kind of underlying concepts he had in mind. And that's the notion that not only are the good and bad deeds being weighed against each other, but the two figures here are each pulling down the scales on their respective sides of the balance. And this shows us that the kind of inspirations that he must have had to be able to arrive at such a specific interpretation comes from the general genre of psychostasia motifs, where Saint Michael is shown weighing the souls at the Last Judgment in religious art, Christian religious arts. Here we have an example that shows exactly the conceptual connection that Gordon is drawing, in that on the left we have an angel who is pulling the pan containing the saint or the virtuous soul, whereas we have a devil on the right that's pulling on the pan with a sinner. So we can't say, of course, that he was thinking of this. In fact, it's already unlikely for various reasons that he was thinking of this specific painting, but we can tell with some certainty that he would have had this motif in mind. Otherwise, he wouldn't have arrived at that particular, that specific interpretation of the two figures by the scale. So this means that it's this arguably specious similarity between the motifs of weighing that allows him to make this connection and to eventually establish this notion that the weighing of the heart is an equivalent of some kind to the Christian Last Judgment. Now, Gordon's interpretation was published in a self-printed pamphlet, and while it is occasionally cited in subsequent literature, it wouldn't have been widely available. So my point is not to argue that this was very influential and created a sort of snowball effect. Rather, the fact that Gordon could so intuitively make this connection indicates that that would have been an interpretation that was also available to other interpreters later on, who do not necessarily specify their inspirations quite as clearly as Gordon does, but nonetheless we can see the connection that one would make simply on the basis of a familiarity with widespread Christian iconography. Now, we should also recall at this point that well before Gordon was writing, it had been established through reinterpretations of Herodotus and Diodorus that the Egyptians were indeed occupied with judgment. So the identification of a motif that seemed so obviously connected to afterlife judgment, eschatology, salvation, was almost too good to be true. It was exactly what one would have expected on the basis of these ideas. However, again, as we saw, these ideas came out of strong expectations that Egyptian afterlife belief should be broadly similar to Christianity, and indeed the weighing of the heart scene was interpreted along the same lines. So this is the background to which people back in Europe became aware of the Book of the Dead in a more detailed manner. The story of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt is quite well known, so I won't go into that here. He famously invaded Egypt in order to establish a colony there. But his army, well, first his navy and subsequently his army, were defeated by the combined efforts of the British and the Ottomans, and in the end he had to withdraw a few years later. However, along with his army, he brought a large group of savants, various scientists who were sent out to study almost every imaginable aspect of Egyptian cultural and natural history, which were subsequently published in the Description de l'Egypte from 1809 forward. Notably, the Description de l'Egypte contained manuscripts of the Book of the Dead, which thus became available for study for European scholars. The first result of the invasion was Dominique Vivant Denon's book, published as early as 1802, which contains, among other illustrations from Egypt, this plate of the weighing of the heart, quite similar in its components to the scene that Gordon had examined in the previous century. However, Denon does not immediately make the funerary connection. He doesn't seem to have been aware of people presenting that, and it's not really where his main interest lies. Rather, he suggests that this is a ritual of some kind, and that it depicts people wearing masks depending on their degree of initiation, different masks for different degrees, and that the weighing imagery is a depiction of the equilibrium of the waters of the Nile. So he has this kind of ecological interpretation of the ritual that's happening here. That doesn't really get picked up. Instead, it's a much more funerary interpretation that ends up becoming influential, namely that of Edme François Chiomard, whom we see here. He ended up eventually becoming editor-in-chief of the Description de l'Égypte, and he was also a very prolific contributor to the work himself. And the quote that we have here dealing with the Book of the Dead comes from his chapter on the rock tombs at Thebes. So he says very succinctly, suffice it to say that it shows, he's talking about the vignette of the weighing of the heart, in all probability, the judgment of the soul of the person on the right of the scene, no doubt the one on whose body was the papyrus. So he doesn't refer to Gordon or other scholars, and in fact, it seems quite likely that he would have arrived, as would other scholars, at this interpretation simply based on the overt similarity between the well-known Christian psychostasium motif and the weighing of the heart. So he presents it quite matter-of-factly in this way, and then he makes a crucial inference a few pages further on, where he basically concludes that if this is a depiction of the ancient Egyptian Last Judgment, then it stands to reason that the rest of the imagery in the Book of the Dead, so we have other images on a typical Book of the Dead roll, that those images would also similarly depict episodes of the ancient Egyptian afterlife. So in this way, the weighing of the heart becomes the linchpin of an entire interpretation of the work as a whole, so that it's not just the Last Judgment that's depicted here, but everything in the Book of the Dead, by definition, is a depiction of the afterlife. He runs with this idea, introduced first into a bark where he pays homage to the great gods Osiris, Isis, and Hippocrates. He moves on to different trials. He is presented before numerous figures emblematic of divinity, before each of whom he makes a prayer, a sacrifice, or an offering, which most of the time consists of one or more flowers of the blue lotus. The figures of the gods occur in threes or fours, and they are masked with the head of a hawk, a jackal, a lion, an ibis, or a baboon. Now, remember that based on the classical authors, there's no particular reason to expect that there would be depictions of trials in the afterlife, even with the reinterpretation of Herodotus and Diodorus. Trials are not really part of the notion. However, as we saw, this idea coming out of the Masonic interpretations of Terrasson. So this is now sort of feeding into the interpretation of the ancient Egyptian work. At the same time, this idea of these kinds of activities in the afterlife also fits really well with the anthropocentric notion of the afterlife that was generally on the rise during this time. So we have the notion of a journey and of a series of activities that need to be undertaken: worship, sacrifices, traveling, even agricultural work, as he identifies in one of the scenes of the Book of the Dead, can be understood within this broadly anthropocentric afterlife model. So if we take a step back and think about the work that this interpretation is doing, we can see that it fills exactly the gap that had been left by late 18th century understandings of the ancient Egyptian afterlife. Where were the trials that people had come to expect from Terrasson and Masonic interpretations? Where are the anthropocentric details? What does this afterlife look like? It's not enough to just have the judgment and the rewards and punishments. We expect more of an afterlife as formulated in the late 18th or early 19th century, and the Book of the Dead is put to exactly that purpose. This is also essentially the interpretation taken over by Jean-François Champollion some years later. Now, Champollion famously deciphered the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic script in 1822, and so it makes sense that for him, the Book of the Dead is first and foremost a text, whereas, as we've seen, earlier interpretations, naturally enough, focused on the images. Other than the focus on the text, however, the interpretation remains very similar to that presented by Jomard. So Champollion says, the great work entitled Jam an Ro na Hort Chem Chru Re, this is the Champollion's transliteration of Egyptian inspired by Coptic. That is to say, the Book of Gates concerning the manifestation in light, a very extensive collection of formulas relating to embalming, the transport of the dead to its hypogea, and containing a host of prayers addressed to all the divinities who could decide the fate of the soul, whether in Amenti, where it was judged, or in the mystical regions that it was supposed to inhabit before restarting the course of its transmigrations. So a couple of points here. We have the judgment taking place in Amenti, and then we have the mystical regions that it was supposed to inhabit. So this is the rest of the Book of the Dead, or all of those other things that happens apart from the judgment. And then we can also see that in spite of this increasingly anthropocentric afterlife, we have the notion of transmigration as a kind of endpoint of the whole process. So that shows that the notion of transmigration is really becoming slightly redundant, especially as people came to more strongly expect an anthropocentric afterlife. So it's being sidelined ever so slightly, even though it's still regarded by the time of Champollion as being part and parcel of the Egyptian beliefs. The study of the Book of the Dead reaches a turning point with the Prussian Egyptologist Karl Richard Lepsius, who wrote this book, Das Totenbuch der Ägypter, which is where he introduced a number of seminal ideas. Firstly, he introduced the name Book of the Dead, Totenbuch, as opposed to Champollion's earlier designation. He called it the funerary ritual, even though, as we saw, he didn't really regard it as a ritual necessarily. It was still a description of the afterlife, but his designation was the funerary ritual, and Lepsius argues that there's no indications that the Book of the Dead was a ritual manual. It doesn't contain the kind of things that Lepsius would expect if it were a ritual manual. He also introduces the chapter numbering that is still in use today, and he introduces or he presents a facsimile of the Book of the Dead, a complete manuscript of the Book of the Dead, allowing people to study the hieroglyphic text in its entirety. So if we ask, why did Lepsius choose the name Book of the Dead? Unfortunately, he doesn't tell us. He just sort of throws it out there as the title of his book, and says why we shouldn't call it. He argues why we shouldn't call it the funerary ritual, but he doesn't really argue in favor of his new designation. Now, there are two possible inspirations. In Lepsius's contemporary German, a Totenbuch, Book of the Dead, was the designation used for ledgers of the people that had died in a particular parish. So it's a Book of the Dead in a quite concrete sense, a book listing the dead. In the later 19th century, the interpretation is presented that the Egyptian inhabitants at Korna referred to the ancient writing that could be found in the tombs and often sold to foreigners as Kutub al-Amwat, books of the dead, literally, in the sense of books belonging to the dead, or books being found with the dead. So it's clear that Lepsius might have been inspired by either, both, or neither of these ideas, but that he had something different in mind, namely that the Book of the Dead was a book of and for the dead, about the afterlife, about death and the dying. That whole cloud of interpretations immediately become activated by the designation Book of the Dead, and probably for that reason it turned out eventually to be very successful, because it aligned quite well with the overall interpretation that had emerged by Lepsius's time. Now, if we look a little bit more closely at Lepsius's interpretation of the Book of the Dead under the kind of conceptual framework he was working with, he talks about the first part of the Book of the Dead in this example here, and he says that it concerns, according to the title, the appearance in light, that is, the transfiguration of the deceased, the final goal of the transmigration of soul. So we have the transmigration coming up again, although the notion of reincarnation doesn't play any role in Lepsius's framework, as far as we can tell from his writing. Rather, he's using transmigration simply to refer to this idea of a journey of the soul coming out of that, of the expectations of the anthropocentric afterlife. And then he says, this is shown pictorially just after the funeral in the tomb, from which he goes forth alive. All the intermediary steps found no pictorial expression and are only briefly and partially touched upon in the individual chapters. So, although in practice he and other scholars of the time are using the Book of the Dead to elucidate the ancient Egyptian afterlife, he also acknowledges that there are things in the afterlife that are not necessarily in the Book of the Dead, when he says that all the intermediary steps found no pictorial expression. So we can see a slight recognition that actually the Book of the Dead as an ancient source doesn't necessarily fit well with the mold that it's increasingly being forced into, but that there are sort of interpretive steps one can take in order to get around that problem. So just as an aside, we've seen the anthropocentric afterlife being very much on the rise. The more details we can squeeze out of the Book of the Dead, the more experientially salient, the more specific, the more individual the afterlife looks, which is a good fit for expectations about afterlife beliefs during the period. And at the same time, the notion of reincarnation gradually becomes sidelined. Now, we might recall that the reason that reincarnation was of interest to European scholars in the beginning, all the way back in the 16th century, was that it allowed to get a notion of judgment and rewards and punishment into the system. You get rewarded or punished depending on the body that that your soul inhabits. Now, with the identification of the weighing of the heart and of various other central scenes in the Book of the Dead, that idea of judgment could be derived seemingly directly from the ancient Egyptian sources themselves, meaning that actually the notion of reincarnation became more and more redundant, and it ended up being abandoned in the mid to late 19th century. Now, the reason I've continued the line here is that while it was abandoned by academic Egyptology, it continued and had an afterlife of its own in esotericism and in mummy entertainment. So you may have wondered, why do we have this trope of the Hollywood trope in mummy movies of the reanimated corpse seeing a living woman and seeing her as a reincarnation of the ancient beloved, which kind of shows up in a number of with variations in a number of mummy movies, and it goes back to mummy fiction in the late 19th century, at a time when the idea of reincarnation had largely been abandoned by academic Egyptology, but it had been taken up by the writers of supernatural horror of the time, and so an example of how ideas live on even when they've been abandoned by academia. So by the time the Book of the Dead was finally translated first in 1867 into English by keeper at the British Museum, Samuel Birch, whom we see here. As we've seen, there was a very clear understanding of what the Book of the Dead was going to be, what it was going to be about, what kind of text it was going to be, and there was also entrenched interpretive strategies that allowed scholars to sidestep the places where the ancient document didn't quite fit the modern expectations. And so we end up with the familiar idea of the Book of the Dead as a literal description and depiction of the afterlife that was given to the deceased so that they could know about what they were going to experience in the afterlife, and conveniently to modern scholars so that they could see exactly what the Egyptians believed. I want to mention briefly here that I explore these questions that we've been looking at so far in much more detail and nuance in the forthcoming book here that Maggie kindly mentioned in the beginning. And there's a flyer out front that allows you to get 30% off. It's coming out in January. You can order it right away if you want. So with that quick commercial break, I will move on to the second part of my lecture, which is considerably briefer, which deals with the question of if, as we have seen, the development of the Book of the Dead, the modern making of the Book of the Dead, was really based on the expectations of Christian scholars, and only very late in the process had any sort of interaction with actual ancient sources. And once those sources were being studied in earnest, they were largely fit into the already existing framework rather than being used to question it. If all of that is the case, as I've argued, then how should we read the Book of the Dead today? Is there a way that we could approach this ancient document, reinstall it in its original social, conceptual context, so that we can sidestep some of this baggage? Now, I think there is, and I'd like to give a brief presentation of what that might look like. So first, from a contemporary point of view, if we reject the idea of the guidebook and all of this, what is the Book of the Dead? Well, as we've seen, the original title is Recitations for Coming Forth by Day. It wouldn't have made much sense to the Egyptians to call it the Book of the Dead. Now, unfortunately, this is a rather slippery title in terms of interpretation, and it can be, it's quite elastic as well, depending on what view you have of the ancient Egyptian afterlife. Coming forth by day can be interpreted in various different ways. It's also worth noting that although it seems to be the case that if you were to ask an Egyptian of the New Kingdom or the Third Intermediate Period, what are you holding in your hand when holding a scroll of the Book of the Dead, they would say these are the recitations for coming forth by day. However, the designation is considerably older. It seems to be sort of an all-purpose designation of funerary text more generally, so there isn't a one-to-one correspondence between recitations for coming forth by day and the Book of the Dead. So there are issues with that designation as well, even if it does clearly come a lot closer to Egyptian conceptions. If we look at the contents and just the format of what we're looking at, it's a collection of ritual recitations, often including titles and instructions for use in rituals. So in that way, the Book of the Dead is similar to other ritual manuals. It's written as though meant to be performed, although the performer is presented as being a dead person. The owner of the Book of the Dead is labeled as the speaker of most of the spells, is set to recite each individual text. And the instructions seem sometimes not really to relate to the funerary context, but seem to be relating to the ritual being carried out by living people, for instance, in a temple or in a healing context. So there are interesting tensions there as well. This already begins to pick up the next point, namely that the recitations originate in a range of different social domains, mainly the temple, the ancestor cult, but also private rituals for healing and protection. It's a heterogeneous corpus. It's a collection from quite different domains, and that in itself means that they're likely to offer literal descriptions of the afterlife. That leads us to the question of the technology of funerary text, which we've come considerably closer to understanding in recent years. The notion of writing down the text of a ritual and putting it in a tomb goes back to the Old Kingdom and the pyramids of the kings of the late 5th and 6th dynasty and continues throughout Egyptian history. And basically, the idea is the invention, the technology is that by putting ritual text in a tomb, you establish an equivalence to carrying out the ritual by other means. It's a ritual performance to write down a ritual text in a tomb or deposit it in a tomb. And that's key to understanding what funerary texts are in general. And it also helps us understand why we can draw text from such different domains and they can all be put in the tomb. And then, just as an aside, unlike earlier funerary texts, recitations were associated with particular images in the Book of the Dead. I'm not going to go deeply into that particular feature today, but there is an effort to systematize and to add images, even to old texts that didn't seem to be associated with images earlier on. So I keep saying that the text of the Book of the Dead are ritual texts, but what exactly does that mean? Well, it has a performative element, certainly, and we also talked briefly about this notion of funerary text, where a ritual is written down in a tomb context. But in particular, that gives us some indications of how we should not read a funerary text. So let's take a typical ritual text that's relatively clear in its purpose and its function, namely a recitation that's meant for curing blisters from any body part of a child. Now, in order to accomplish this, the ritualist recites, "You are horrors, for you have awakened as horrors. You are the living horrors, as I remove the illness which is in your body and the suffering which is in your limbs." And it goes on like this for a considerable time. So the idea is that of identifying the patient with the young horrors who in mythology is being protected in the Delta Marshes from a number of threatening influences and illnesses, and so there is a mythological precedent that's being applied to the real-life situation. Now, when reading it in this way, we wouldn't be tempted to make the kind of interpretive step that is traditionally, since the 19th century, made with the funerary texts, namely that this is a literal description of a transcendent reality. It's clearly an application of a mythological pattern to a real-life example, a real-life crisis that the mythological pattern is meant to alleviate. So if we were reading this along the lines of funerary text, if this had happened to be written in a Book of the Dead, read in the traditional manner of interpreting the Book of the Dead, we would have to say that the ancient Egyptians believed that when you got blisters, you became horrors. In other words, we get it. We put the cart before the horse in the sense that this is the solution. It's not a literal description of a belief. It is an application of a mythological precedent to a real-life situation, in the same way as the mythology of Osiris is often being deployed in the funerary context. Not because it's a literal belief that this is what happened in some transcendent reality, but because mythology is powerful and can influence real-life situations. So just to recapitulate then what the Book of the Dead is not. It's not an exposition, whether narrative or not, of beliefs about the afterlife, and consequently it's not a guidebook for the deceased and modern scholars to the beyond. I'd like to just show a quick example of this in practice, since we've been talking about the weighing of the heart scene. This scene, seen here in the wonderful example that's shown next door, often accompanies the text of either chapter 30b, which is a heart spell about bringing the heart of the owner under control, or the so-called declaration of innocence. That's the center of chapter 125. So to illustrate my point, I'd like to focus on the declaration of innocence from Book of the Dead, chapter 125, where the owner of the Book of the Dead is presented as speaking to 42 divine figures, each of whom is told about a particular transgression that the owner has not committed. O broad of step, who comes from Yunu, I have done no injustice. O flame embracer, who comes from hereafter, I have not robbed. O beaked god, who comes from Remenu, I have not been greedy, and so on. Now, since the 19th century, this has been understood, since it's depicted right next to that image, allegedly, of the ancient Egyptian Last Judgment, this declaration of innocence or negative confession has been seen as a list of the things that you could not have done if you're going to be saved, if you're going to have a successful afterlife judgment. But if we take a step back and realize, as we have today, just how colored that idea is by Christian expectations and the expectations of early scholars going back to well before the 19th century, then how would we contextualize this? How would we put this back in its cultural context in ancient Egypt? Well, it's been known since the mid-20th century that this text, or very similar text, occurs in various other connections, notably in the examples that I show here, where we have priestly oaths in Egyptian, translated into Greek, was the theory, and we now know that this is correct from my identifications of the Egyptian original in the so-called Book of the Temple. So this is a Greek, likely second century CE translation of Egyptian priestly oaths of the type that we've just seen, listing a lot of things that the priests have not done. They have to say that they haven't done it during the course of their ritual initiation. Similarly, we find very similar wordings on temple walls, where the intention seems to be to control the access to particular areas of the temple, that in order to enter, you have to have a particular state of purity, and that state of purity entails not having done all of these things. So in other words, we begin to get a sense that this is not a question of eschatology or soteriology of salvation of the soul. It's a question of purity and the resultant ritual competency, the ability to carry out rituals within a particular space. So in the traditional discussion, the question has been, which of these came first? So do we have an afterlife belief which was adopted into the temple cult as a ritual of initiation or purification of priests? Or is it the other way around, that we have a temple ritual which is used for inspiration for afterlife beliefs? Now, both of these scenarios that scholars have been discussing back and forth, and some people support one scenario, others the other, but both of those ideas presuppose the notion that this is part of a concrete afterlife belief, that this is something that the Egyptians thought would happen in the beyond when you died. Now, as we have seen, that idea is historically contingent and dependent on very particular expectations of early scholars. And so if we reject that well, not necessarily reject it, but if we say we can't presuppose that that is the case, that just because it occurs in the Book of the Dead, it doesn't mean that it's a concrete afterlife belief of the ancient Egyptians, then we get a rather different notion of how these things interrelate. In that case, we would have in the middle the concept, and most likely also the practice, of purification rites, where a person gets purified by reciting a series of transgressions that they have not performed, and in the end they can declare their purity. Now, this is relevant for priestly oaths because purity is a precondition for carrying out rituals that the priests are supposed to carry out. For similar reasons, purity is relevant for text controlling access to particular areas of the temple. You have to have different levels of purity in different parts of the temple, and one way to achieve purity, again, is through the purification ritual. And finally, we get the same purification ritual in funerary papyri, because a main theme in funerary papyri is precisely the purity and hence the ritual competence, the ability to participate in rituals securing the cycles of the world. None of these, oops, I think it's up. None of these mean that there's a literal belief in a transcendent reality where this is happening exactly as described. They're all rituals carried out for their efficacy, which is relevant in slightly different ways in each of these contexts. And this shows up in a number of different places. And in fact, as this image here shows, that I'll go over very quickly for considerations of time, shows just what a large proportion of the images are actually the deceased worshipping, carrying out rituals. This is a very absolutely central theme, and if we understand that as images of religious worship, of religious practice, of participation in rituals, rather than as something happening in the in a transcendent individual afterlife, then I think we have taken a step closer to reconstructing the original context, the settings, the social settings, the conceptual settings of the text and images of the Book of the Dead. Now, this is a point already made by historian of religion Jørgen Poulmann Sørensen, this ubiquity of ritual in the Book of the Dead. And so with that, we come at last to the end of the points I wanted to make. So in speaking of the modern making of the ancient Book of the Dead, this is a provocative wording, but one that I hope I've made a case for in showing that what we think of when we think of the Book of the Dead, the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead, as a guidebook to the beyond, giving a literal description of the ancient Egyptian afterlife, this is actually something that is quite far removed from the ancient, the role that work played in ancient society, and it's quite dependent precisely on the kind of conceptual frameworks that developed gradually over time with inspiration from shifting ideas about what the afterlife, mainly the Christian afterlife, was actually like, which was then in turn used more or less deliberately as inspiration for what the ancient Egyptian afterlife was like. Thank you very much for your attention.